Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining this space that was long in the making. The most problematic part of it was, once again, the suspension that happened very recently. A suspension that I'm going to add a small note that is working through now a probable loophole when it comes to reports over authenticity. So far, the last two suspensions were over a lack of authenticity, which leads me to believe that there is some foul play around there, because it would make no sense to suspend someone for unauthentic behavior based on the usual complaints or reports that someone would lodge over me. So basically, unless pretending that I'm Russian, whereas I obviously am not, I don't see the point on what would be unauthentic. If there is one thing that you guys might well be recognizing here, is that I have never changed my opinion, and I have never changed my type of, let's say, talk since the first actual suspension in 2022, where my dry and rather analytical reporting was being drawn into a pile of Nafoid and anti-Russian shit. But once again, that's social media for you. Anyway, so the third part is very specific. We are going with a accountability issue. As I told you guys, the basis for this space would have been the analytical thread that I did to a piece coming out of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which was trying to actually So guys, welcome back once again. It seems that Negron Musk has huge issues when it comes to hearing the truth. The start of the space was once again blocked and self-deleted by, I don't know how to explain it, because I'm not even on Wi-Fi or whatever. It's full 5G, so should not be any kind of problem. In any case, let's go back to where we started. So basically, the space would be articulated over a small thread that I made, discussing over the subject of one Radio Svoboda article regarding the explanation of why the trend of losses in recent times, quote unquote, because it was really recent times, was going down for the Russians and going up for the Ukrainians. As I explained already, the issue isn't really the late 2025. The issue started for the Ukrainians very early after Kursk, and this was completely normal, because in Kursk, Ukrainians tried to seize the operational initiative. The strategic initiative, as I said, was not possible for them. They simply didn't have enough equipment, and they didn't have enough space to maneuver elsewhere, but to try once again to hit the Russian territory, suspected being less defended, with a reason. And most importantly, the analysis I made right off the bat, the 6th of August 2024, stays still true, in the sense that Ukraine had already lost Kursk the moment it started the operation. And back then, if you remember, first thing I noticed, and I told you guys, you have multiple units that have been patched up together with a very disparate equipment. You had British tanks, Polish tanks, then American tanks, American IAVs, German IAVs, Ukrainian IAVs, Swedish IAVs, all kinds of equipment, all kinds of mobility vehicles, all kinds of armored vehicles, MRAPs. In short, we had the constitution of what I claimed back then was a bad LARP of a Kampfgruppe. And indeed, this is something that a lot of people noticed also on the other side. And a late analysis around the month of April 2025 literally took verbatim what I said. The problem that happened, of course, is that the operation was supposed to be limited, or should have been limited, which is wrong. Actually, Kursk made no sense. If you went there for a limited period of time, Kursk had to be a strategic gambit on pulling the Russians away from everywhere else in Donbass and focusing on Kursk. The problem, just like in the counter 2023, the equipment at hand, the forces at hand were just not able to deploy a proper maneuver component, which made that it's true they went way too deep for their own good, but also for the Russian defensive perimeter back then. But they still didn't reach the size and the importance and the threat that they were supposed to reach in order to force the Russians to redeploy large amounts of equipment and forces to stop them, therefore stalling other pushes on other fronts. I made this remark in 2024. We followed up with the logic that if the Ukrainians would keep that kind of losses for such a limited front for over 2-3 weeks, they would have completely lost the game. As we had the evidence quickly enough, within about 2 weeks, every attempt to sustain the operation was dead. So they lost even the local initiative pretty fast. Whatever they had to do to keep the salient alive, we saw immediately that it would cost them a huge amount of troops and equipment. And we saw that immediately because not even 3 weeks within the Kursk operation, the maximum advance that they had, that was supposed to be between 900 and 1,200 square kilometers. Once again, I'm not sure it was that thing. I think that the core area that they were defending, not simply sending advanced troops, was somewhere around 700 square kilometers, which was still pretty bad. That those 1,200 to 900 immediately fell by September down to about 650. But of course, Cope State went with its bullshit and made it a 900 square kilometers and then dropped it down to about 750 square kilometers. So right off the bat, you could understand that the operation that was supposed to be some kind of at least operational initiative failed completely due to the fact that, once again, I repeat, operationally, the Ukrainians are indigent. And it's not only their fault. It's not because they are some kind of stupid army, which they are on their own, right? But simply they do not have neither the backing, the planning, or the capability when it comes to generally equipment and manpower to sustain something that would require from them to actually capture the strategic initiative, which means that over the whole front, the Ukrainians would actually be on the counteroffensive or the offensive. So once you analyze it that way, you start to understand a couple of things. First of all, why Kursk? What happened? Back then, I had already pointed out by the words of someone else, Mr. Lokeson. I will find his tweet and repost it so you can basically understand what I meant. He described it very simply. The trend was going against Zelensky and co. So Zelensky had need to do something. This is what the whole team had said that if by July, August, nothing would happen, the snowballing effect that we were already seeing post the May 2024 maneuver around Kharkov would take such a huge toll on the Ukrainians that it would simply cripple them for the rest of the war and probably would cause them a very painful 2025. The only thing that we didn't sow, in my opinion, with the team was, I mean, not everybody. We had guys in the team that were believing that something would happen within Russia and within Kursk, but I personally thought that was the most stupid aspect, because going to Kursk into a mostly forested area, very flat, would lead you to getting bombed to shit, never mind how far it would go. On top of it, due to the, once again, flat area, it was very good for a fast action, but then, once you got stopped, there was not much in the way. If you want to analyze this, look at what the Russians were doing once they passed Avdiivka. They had a huge patchwork of smaller settlements. Over 380,000 people were living in this patchwork, where they could just latch themselves way after way. If you compare that to Kursk, especially the area that was chosen by the Ukrainians, you had a big max 50,000 people spread in a at least as big area as the Russians were contesting to the Ukrainians back in 2024. So the value of the target from both sides was so lopsided that it made no sense for anyone who saw that Kursk would yield anything else but a huge defeat, unless, and that's where I think the Ukrainians tried to make something out of nothing, which is, if you start threatening areas like, for instance, going towards Kurchatov, or trying to expand, blocking Tetkino, and taking the area that is beyond the river in Tetkino, then you will have the Russians needing to actually bomb the shit out of you, or attack you physically, a bit like what happened in Krinky. And if you remember, this is what we said right off the bat, it was Krinky on steroids. The difference is that in Krinky, you were losing less due to the very fact that you had to cross the river. In Kursk, the problem was that if you start to play 1-to-1 against the Russians and it goes badly, you would need to reinforce it also 1-to-1 with your losses. Which meant, and we saw that from the beginning, that going to the offensive against the Russians, despite everything you're going to do them, capturing people, capturing land, was going to cost you logistically a lot more than it was going to bring you. So, what does this mean? Very simple. You are going on enemy territory, your logistical reach should be at least 30 kilometers within Russia, which they almost managed, and that meant that you will have at least 10 to 15 kilometers as a staging ground from Ukraine. And if you want a illustration of that, you can see what happened with Pisarivka at the end, of course, of the operation, when the whole flank was completely open to Russian drone ops, but not only, and which led to a very short but massive bleeding in assets, especially logistical ones, that forced the Ukrainians to completely cut off the Pisarivka angle and try to go within the center of the salient that was still existing by there, about like 400, 350 square kilometer salient. Why all of this bullshit? Simply to explain you that the situation that was belatedly caught on by piggers, therefore we are having a lot more losses that we are inflicting on the Russians, didn't start the last month of 2025. We describe this as a shadow counter. What does this mean? Ukraine, by attempting Kursk, in my opinion, had the idea that the Russians were going to overreact, so they're going to stop some operations within the Donbass, or all of them, pull troops as much as possible out of there, and fight the Kursk salient. And everybody was expecting that the Russians would win, including myself. Once again, I'm not going to pretend on that one I was very wrong, but actually it was a better option. Now we're looking at it from 2025. I wasn't advocating for going all in with stopping the operations in Ukraine. Quite the contrary, because to me it was, as I described back then, I will always describe it like this. For the Ukrainians, this meant burning the candle by both sides. You are sending shit into a place where you have nothing to gain from, because even Zelensky himself said, oh, we don't want to keep Kursk, what we want is to have a bargaining chip so the Russians would stop doing what they're doing. However, I think that was one of the biggest mistakes that Zelensky did. As I said, first of all, you just explain your core argument. Not that it needed explaining. I mean, it was obvious that what Kursk was going to be was a bargaining chip. Was a swap of land between Kursk and whatever they were holding up in Kharkov, for instance, or more territory. It doesn't really fucking matter. But it was never going to be those even 1,200 square kilometers of Kursk with the rest of Donbass. It made no sense. So the whole point of Kursk, right from the bat, was performative, propagandistic, and most importantly, delusional. It was so much delusional that actually when a lot of people were panicking when Kursk happened, the whole team was just fucking popping champagne. Because it was so insane and would mean such a huge beating for the Ukrainian forces that we couldn't believe the Ukrainians would take a self-own like that. Or we just thought that they would stop earlier. In any case, once again, this is just to explain to you how the team already saw what was going to happen in 2025. For a long while, we had discussed about that leveling of playing field. Ukrainians, since the beginning of this war, in order to have a chance, need to achieve a 1-to-5 loss ratio when it comes to any kind of equipment against Russians. That would keep the Russians problematically dry enough not be able to focus on the whole front. And I made a quick analysis. If you remember, we went from 8,600 roughly to about 5,100 something so 8,600 roughly in 2022 in 10 months and a week. Then 5,000 the whole year in 2023, 5,200, let's be gross. And then we went in 2024 to 6,000. That, of course, was having as repercussion the Ukrainian losses. Ukrainian losses 2022, 2,700 vehicles. These are Oryx numbers. Don't fucking fire on me for those. I already explained back then in the thread that Oryx has huge issues. Starting with 2023, Oryx is not to be taken at face value unless looking at the trend, because the trend you cannot hide. You can hide a couple of things, you just cannot hide the trend. So basically, Ukrainians went up 2.7k in 2022, then moved back to about 2,200 in 2023, which already showed that they were way under what they need to do. Whereas in 2022, they were close, but still no cigar to the 1.5 ratio, or even 1.1 to 4 ratio. Then 2023, they moved to under 2.5 to 1. And then in 2024, again, under 2.5 to 1 losses. So while the Russian losses were huge, they still were nowhere near crippling enough to afford the Ukrainians any kind of advantage past 2022. So in short, Ukrainians had already shot their shot in 2022, and everything from there on was just them getting grinded. Now, in 2025, the biggest issue was there is a huge outlier on both sides. First of all, 2025 so far, I need to check latest number of Oryx, but when I did the thread, the Ukrainians were at about 3.2k. losses within 10 months and 3 weeks. Russians were at 3.7 during the same time. So you can see the trajectory of the Russian losses going from 8.6 to 5.2 to 6.1 and then now to 3.7. The falling of the cliff, even if the Ukrainians are not showing all the losses, but let's say that 50% more, that not 100% more, 50% more, which means out of 3.7, you're going to have about 1.85K that is still not there. You would be at roughly 5.6 to 3.2. It's even with that in mind, which is very, 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 I'm going to repeat, extremely improbable because Ukraine is down to literally showing individual soldiers getting droned, let alone letting go 1,500 vehicles, 1,600 vehicles not destroyed. So once you start analyzing it, you understand that the outlier, even with the caveat of there are this many not shown, it's an outlier because the Ukrainian losses on their own are already not complete. As I already explained down the thread, if we have to be accurately accounting for the Ukrainian losses, we would be more probably around 3.6, 3.7. Mostly because the Ukrainian losses are not accounted for if there is no BDA, so battle damage assessment, so a aftermath of the Russian drone slamming to that ship. But if you start accounting for those, then you understand that, guys, I don't think that this year is very good for Ukraine, and the losses accounted by other aggregators from war spotting were actually 1-1, or rather 0.95-1. So basically Ukraine had lost more in 2025 than the Russians. Now, the issue with that, once again, was that this, and this is the subject of the space today, and you're going to understand why it's so complicated and so important for Ukraine, is that instead of taking into account the situation and starting to look to all the numbers, first of all, there was a decision to look only at the 3-4 last months in 2025, which is stupid, because once you take over the war spotting report, you're going to see that it didn't happen in 3 months. You didn't lose 3,000 extra vehicles in 3 months. No, what happened is that you lost probably about 400 per month the last month because you are forced to do something over the Russians literally raping your ass. And before that, you had this very unfortunate selection of criteria where you could see a tank that was a goner for sure, but because there was no aftermath, the Ukrainians, or at least Oryx in this case, Kursk was absolutely atrocious for that, because at some point there were no real losses for the Ukrainians, and then suddenly once Kursk has fallen and the Russians are getting their advances on tape and seeing the losses they had actually inflicted upon the Ukrainians in 2024 and early 2025, then you start understanding like, oh my god, actually those strikes that weren't counted by Oryx at the due time are coming back to haunt them. And this was also another explanation for why Russian advances are forcing the Ukrainians to show more losses. Because when you advance, the side who pulls back cannot pull back his shit. I'm not saying that before they were doing the same thing, but simply in 2022, due to the unfortunate events, both in Kherson and Kharkov, the side who advanced could show whatever they wanted. It wouldn't show, for instance, I don't know, the losses on BTRs. That's one of the things that was grabbing me, how the fuck did the Ukrainians advance with a shitty color of BTRs and got up to Kupiansk. But that's the thing. The side who advances is forcing losses upon the other side, but on top of it, is also discovering shit that the other side has not been able to pull out. And this is one of the things that, of course, the people at Raja Svoboda were not going to insist. They're not going to explain things as it should be explained. There are other reasons. For instance, there is as I said, as I described, there are three major reversals, quote unquote, that the Russians inflicted on the battlefield, which allow them to show more losses, and I will speak about that a bit later. But the most important part here is that why are not pro-Ukrainians able to keep the Ukrainian authorities accountable? Mostly because the skin in this game is in huge part ideological. Not ideological like back in the day, communism versus capitalism, or East versus West. Although that thing is popping out, especially with the whole Dragon Bear fantasy or nightmare for the Westerners. But here, it has more to do with the fact that Russia is still seen as an underdeveloped country. I'm sorry to say it like that. You have to do with it. You have to bear with it. And a lot of the things that you're hearing, for instance, the use of the lack of indoor plumbing, the lack of indoor toilets, the systematic belittling of Russia's issues with the winter due to its road system and everything and all that stuff. There is, unfortunately, a very ideological take, doctrinal take, that we are superior, the Western society is superior to the Russian society because we are more developed. But the reality is completely different. Development makes no difference to the state of operation that you have. I mean, I could drive on a fucking Maybach. It will not make me able to take some dude out. I'm not speaking about hand-to-hand combat, but on a shootout. Because it doesn't depend on how fucking much money I have. Money is going to play if I can use it properly. So in this case, pay 10 guys to go and kill the dude. But the take that we've had so much GDP and all that shit shows a mental figment which is still somewhere between 92 and 99. And it includes also this absolute mind-blowing vision of denial when, if you start making comparisons, people go, 3 days to Kiev is becoming 4 years of war. And I'm like, yeah, because there are reasons for it. Nothing happens without reason. Doesn't mean these reasons are positive for Russia. But you need to analyze the things as they are. There comes the accountability. Because those 4 years of war, they are taking a toll of both sides. But once again, the toll is quadrupled or quintupled for the side who has a lot less and is not able to inflict or at least inflex the losses towards the bigger size. This was the case, at least materially, in 2022. That was a huge marker there. You could see that the Russians were almost at 3-1 for some aspects and assets. For tanks, for instance, they were up to 4-1 due to the atrocious results from Kharkov and also from some boneheaded decisions to attack the good old way, let's say it like that, and ignoring both the ISR help for Ukraine, but also the drone atomization of the battlefield, and also the quasi-transparency due to the drone presence of the on the battlefield in Ukraine. So, what does this even mean? Why am I bothering you with shit that you already know? Does it even matter? It does. Why does it matter? Because it's not just people on Twitter. The people who are actually analyzing this, despite most of them, I'm going to repeat, are Ostenters, are people who have no fucking clue how war is is being fought in Ukraine. They have only information from what they can glance at, looking at things, but also what is being told to them. And this is where things get extremely problematic. Because one of the major sources that I have, on top of the footage that is disseminated from both sides, is what is being told to them by the Ukrainian leadership. There is nobody on the Russian side going to, I don't know, to Kaufman or going to Radio Svoboda and saying, oh, guys, there is this that I'm doing, and this perfectly fine. A lot of the information that Timor criminal is finding out goes from literally having to score. So basically, we have people who speak the damn language, and I'm going to make a very bad joke, but recently I've been more and more surprised to not need to double check through translation what I'm reading, what I'm hearing. And that was one thing that I told to the group. How do you know that you've been following this war for so long? Is that my very basic knowledge of Russian at the beginning of the war has probably evolved into something that I will not once again say that I'm fluent. Quite the contrary. I probably can survive somewhere in a Russian city. But it makes things so easy. And unfortunately, that should not be a problem for those guys who are supposedly analyzing. But unfortunately, it does, because the people who are analyzing most, if you see on that article who the fuck you went to actually talk to, most of them are not Russian speakers. I'm pretty sure of it, because there were some huge problems when you see, for instance, someone like Jompi or someone like Jakub. All these people made very basic mistakes. But it's not only a language barrier, it's also a mental vision and also lack of experience of what they're looking at. So when they started to explain everything by Russia pulled out tanks and equipment and went with Ladas, of course we're all laughing on the side of Timor criminal, because the guys who started using civilian equipment from day zero was literally Ukraine. We have all these funny clips, like the guy who had stolen or got gifted a DHL van from some country, city in Germany. Then we had a couple of plumbing ads, bit like in Syria, but this case was more funny because the guy had literally sold the truck, the pickups. But for a long while, Ukrainian backbone, logistical backbone, were pickups, were second-hand pickups. And everybody knows the fun and jokes about Polish or Latvian plates with a lot of brain matter around them. From the get-go, the Ukrainian army was reliant on light vehicles. And suddenly, because the Russians quote-unquote go into assaults with them, Russia has changed its fucking tactic, and therefore, in order to have a fuller picture, we need to also check those pickups. Unfortunately, as I already said, I even have a discussion with some retard from the other side. The problem when you start doing that, you obviously are going to end up watching Rubicon footage, but also other footage like Bobber in 2023 of FPV slamming mainly into light vehicles. Because for Ukraine, it made sense from the get-go to forego heavier vehicles, especially for logistics, simply because they were to stay stealthy and also a bit perfidious. It is what it is. Ukraine, from the starting of this war, played the perfidy card, because basically there is no way to distinguish a Ukrainian from a Russian at first sight. But even when it comes to language, given that they speak the same motherfucking language, of course with dialects, of course with idiosyncrasies, but it is what it is. They're fucking Russophone people. You can pretend that this didn't happen, especially Ukrainian nationalists, but the reality is there. And you can point out to, I don't know, some kind of imperial gift and shit like that, the reality is pretty simple. Ukrainians and Russians are almost indistinguishable, and we've had also multiple situations like that when one side has pretended to be the other. We had this perfidious shooting from a Ukrainian that joined two Russian soldiers. They spoke, Ukrainians pretended to be Russian, waited until they turned around and shot them behind their heads. And this is how this war is actually. So once you get through this logic, when you cannot justify the lack of equipment losses on the Ukrainian side by the fact that Russians are using more light vehicles, which is true. Russians are using more light vehicles than they were before the start of the war. But for the Ukrainian side, this doesn't change. Ukrainians would still lose like 1,000 pickups or 2,000 pickups per month. From day 1 to day 1,500. For the Russians, of course, this was something new, although the Bukhanka broke out in 2023 as a logistical asset. So at the end, those losses, and I made this quick analysis with Rita, I told you, when I pointed out that even by Andy the pedo, the kind of tonnage, the kind of equipment, the kind of troops that were being moved out by the losses of, I'd say, 55 or 60 Ukrainian pickups and a flurry of different assets on the Russian side, like 35 motorbikes, 10 ATVs, and the rest were other type of vehicles, small cars, Bukhankas. Once you mash up everything and do the tonnage and also transportation, you see that it's literally the same kind of stuff, numerically wise, that is being moved by both sides. And that's the funny thing, because let's say that you're going to see those losses, going to analyze them, and I said you will have roughly 400 people being moved by pickups. And on this side, you will have about 400 people going to assaults and doing logisticals on the Russian side. So when you start looking at that, you understand that, first of all, the war has been going down. It has been becoming smaller. But it's also a lot more lethal, which paradoxically, and this is something that a lot of people don't get, paradoxically, if the war is getting lethal, a smaller group has more chance to be completely wiped out, killed. This is what actually plays in, theoretically, in the advantage of the Russian side. Why? Less Ukrainians, a more lethal method of killing them, means that your Ukrainian platoon or Ukrainian unit that's going to attack your ass or do logistics or pull back is going to be wiped out. You don't need to think about those. It's not like early in the war when you're going to fucking wound 10 and kill 2. And of course, while one body or the 2 bodies are going to stay there, the 10 wounded will still be able to move out by their own means or whatever. This is how the war actually is becoming more lethal. You have something that I actually spoke about since 2022. The way Ukrainians were waging war was an extermination war. So the Russian soldier that was wounded was better exterminated than captured. Because for the Ukrainians, already back then, the logic was simple. We're a lot less. If you start taking prisoners or wounding them or letting them evacuate them, what's going to happen is that in 3 to 5 months, the guy who we didn't amputate or, torn off his limbs, is going to come back and shoot at us. So, from the get-go, there was this no-quarter logic. And, of course, it was dressed up as resistance, as the sacred duty of the defender of the fatherland, all that bullshit. And this is also something that a lot of NAFOids are still keeping. Oh, a defender can do whatever he wants, he's defending his country. No, that's not how war works, and the customary law of warfare works. But once again, it doesn't matter. NAFOids and turbo crops are just oxygen thieves at this point. But other people who are supposed to be experts and analysts and all this shit, not having the gall to actually take Ukraine's into account and actually ask the hard questions, it's funny, especially if they have the data. And I didn't go as far as I wanted because the thread was just a basis for what we are doing now. But once you start analyzing the losses, as I said, from Kursk, you can see that there is a huge reversal in trend of losses. And of course, a huge part is due to the fact that Kursk, despite the fact that it stopped very early, being a fully offensive situation, was still a huge salient with only 2 roads in and out. Therefore, it allowed the Russians to track down the Ukrainians because of the limitation, and as I said, work on the fire base. And of course, Kursk coincided with a huge crunch of artillery on Ukrainian side, and also the impossibility for a lot of the artillery that Ukrainians were using to be effective at longer range. And of course, in Kursk, we had the first systematic tracking down of HIMARS assets, which, in my opinion, made it extremely complicated for the Ukrainians to do what they usually did up until June 2024, which was, oh, you're having an issue, you cannot fly over there, you cannot drop whatever GBU you can with the planes, send a HIMARS and leg it. We saw that in Kharkov, HIMARS were getting mildly targeted, and because the Ukrainians do not have that many, and they lost counted and, pulled back the troops for an assessment on how the loss happened, and therefore less activity, which allowed the Russians to actually stabilize, move forward, and so forth and so on. Same thing in Kursk. The inability to actually support advanced points and lose them little by little, despite the presence of drones, made that at some point, and we had this wonderful example, the drone ops would be surrounded by Russian infiltration, and, well, you know what happened. In your underwear, 2 rows, ventilation, and then you leave the corpses there so the Ukrainians can recover them, make this huge BDA video for us, which was pretty funny. I need to admit, I shouldn't laugh about that because it's horrible, but it was funny because a lot of people said that it wasn't true, or they weren't drone ops and stuff like that. Turns out that, it was true, and on top of it, as we understood now that I have the videos, it wasn't even a capture, the point wasn't even captured, it was still on gray zone, it was a raid, they knew where the drone ops were, surrounded them, pulled them out, and liquidated a whole bunch. Now, this logic is actually where the analysis should have been. The Russians at some point understood there are gaps in the Kursk defense, and therefore there are going to be gaps in Donbass defense. And it's logical. First of all, as I said, you have to split. Initially, I had calculated about 10,000 men for the Kampfgruppe in Kursk. Due to the losses, due to all the units that we see mentioned in the obituaries, I think they started with 10,000, thinking that it would suffice for a 3 to 4 months operation, and then probably they would try to pull them out if the Russians were going too hard. But for some reason, they kept these guys there. And we end up now with somewhere between 15 and 20,000 killed, missing, or captured, and therefore at least the same number of wounded and carried off. Which means that the Kursk operation would cost them about 40,000 casualties. Even if it's not 40,000, 30,000. And it's 30,000 for a literal post stamp, which over the 7 months that it lasted went from, I think, less than 3% of any of the oblast that is currently contested by the Russians to basically 0% of that oblast. Nobody pointed out that, guys, Kursk was a huge mistake. You fucked up. You need to do something. Nobody's saying that. Everybody that I'm listening, when they analyze Kursk as a mistake, they analyze it as a mistake in the duration. So it was too long. But Kursk wasn't too long or too short. Getting AIDS is not about, oh my God, now I can survive 20 more years. You got AIDS, bitch. Kursk was AIDS for the Ukrainian army. And I'm going to explain you why. First of all, one thing that happened in Kursk is that it gave them that quick high. It's literally the guy who tries drugs for the first time. In Ukrainian case, it wasn't the first time. They had already enjoyed that high during March 2022, September 2022, Kharkov, and then, generally speaking, the stalling of the Russian offensive and the recovery of Kherson in November 2022. And because of that high that I hit, they pushed too far in 2022, 2023. They got stuck at the Oskol line and they got kicked back. Slowly, methodically, very difficult task for the Russians. Fast forward 2024, in Kursk, you are again advancing, but this time in Russia, and it looks like it's working. And remember what was said? Oh, the Ukrainians got in 3 days what the Russians got in a whole year in Ukraine. And I'm like, sorry guys, it doesn't work like that. You have to look always to the cost, effectiveness of your move. And while it might be true that immediately you're going to get these 1,000 square kilometers, the only thing that has to be true is that how long and how much of that are going to keep to the end. So now we have the Ukrainian junkie who gets another high, he's fine, but suddenly things stop. And they stop in a very specific manner. They do not stop on hand-to-hand combat, Kharkov, Kherson-style advances. No, that is the first and second day when they capture about 500 to 700 Russian soldiers, them being a mix of conscripts, border guards, and other guys to send there to reinforce them. Of course, a part of it also happens, according to the Ukrainians themselves, in full perfidy, and some of the guys are killed while being unarmed. Anyway, bygones are bygones. Now we're having war justice every single day. Another one happened in Uliapole, by the way. 4 guys. So, once you start thinking like this, you have this first high, then very, very fast, within a week or so, you go from we're taking Suja to we're getting raped in Giri. And Safonovka. Safonovka is a completely different aspect of it because it shows how much this war is the same for everyone. When you lack the same awareness that the other side, it's just that, it happens only once to the Ukrainian and then they stop doing that bullshit at the same level. So, Giri is Russia's introducing, as I said, the first reversal, which is technical. In Kursk, we saw the introduction of the optifiber FPVs, and that thing served to, within, I think, 15 FPVs, annihilate a convoy of 8 BTR-4s, a couple of pickups, and a couple of vehicles that were stolen from Kursk residents. The moment this happens, there is an intervention also from motorized 2 BTR-82s that come to play after that. But the moment that this happens, you notice something, and initially we didn't know. I had 2 versions. One was some kind of pure GPS guidance of the FPVs, a bit like what the Ukrainians are doing now with the Starlink-equipped drones in Crimea and elsewhere. And the second one was optifiber. We suddenly understood that it was optifiber first and foremost, and The other attempts were just too expensive. And, well, it's true. The OptiFiber, as I said, changed the playground for the Ukrainians because it was unjammable. It still is unjammable, except from cutting the thread. And even then, you need to see the thing coming through and so forth. So it's literally the least possible situation. And the fact that they're unjammable means that they're also not detectable by refraction. So you know that something is now everywhere in the battlefield on both sides, and those are spectrum analyzers or quote-unquote FPV/drone detectors. How they work, they basically see the presence of radio wave emissions, and then you know that there is something on that wavelength. And now by almost over 2 years, you have detectors that would say you exactly what is looking at you by looking at the wavelength and, of course, the type of footprint that drone had left from before. So you can hear DJI, FPV, Mavic, whatever, doesn't fucking matter. But you're going to have a very, very thorough analysis and detection of the drone. Some of them even give you a distance. Once again, this is just me being a boomer. So don't take this as some kind of trying to. But the moment that your individual detector doesn't work because of OptiFiber, first of all, you don't know what's coming at your ass. And this is very important for vehicles that have ammunition on board and vehicles that are busy actually firing. So one thing that is going down, and you can see it, artillery is getting raped on the Ukrainian side. And this technical switch on the Russian side, as I said, given the lack of jamming, gives you two main things. First of all, a specific identification of your target, down to the impact. So you know exactly what you're hitting. It's not like before when up to 20 meters, you had to more or less steer your radio frequency drone or FPV because you were jammed and visually you couldn't see it past the 20 meters. So it could be like a MRAP, it could be a tank. Of course, tanks you would see, but for other vehicles it was a bit more complicated. But most importantly, you could guide now your drone to the most sensitive parts. So we've seen Bogdanas being hit while the crew is loading and arming. We've seen Panzer Haubitzers getting fucked. We've seen even HIMARS getting fucked. So the problem of the passive or unemitting OptiFiber FPV drones changes the things completely. Of course, there is a problem of the optical fiber situation when now you see fields full of them. But initially, the fear was that they're going to follow up your fiber, they're going to hit you. But now there are so many of them, you don't know where they're coming from. You have full fields, and the wind is more and more expanding them. So you're going to have a fast shot more or less, but you don't know exactly where they're coming from. On top of it, it's not even complicated. Because of the higher success rate of the FPVs and the terminal guidance and magnification of your target, you know exactly what you hit, where you hit it, and you can follow up pretty quickly. Now we have also multiple teams hunting at the same time. So that great innovation on the Russian side makes it possible, first of all, to catch the Ukrainians, pants down, make sure to hit the Ukrainians where it counts, where it matters, and most importantly, gives you a image perfect accountability on what you hit, where you hit it, and what the result is. These technical modification change alone gives you an extra, I'd say, 10 to 20% hits that you have on tape. So you know how much you hit. There is also a operational reversal. As I said, it's not really an operational reversal. It's just that the Russians now can make use of their overall posture and pressure the Ukrainians exactly where they want them to be pressured. And in a certain sense, it is also due to the optic fiber. Given that you have now a definitive list of what you hit, you can start making into account, because first of all, you start knowing which units there, but because you know that Ukraine has issues with the material, means that some units that are supposed to be there are already depleted. So in order to reinforce them, you're going to either bring new units or take the equipment, like it happened in Kursk. Some units were deprived of their most up-to-date subunits in order to make this camp group. So once I'd say you've destroyed 30 tanks around Kupiansk in, I don't know, a month or two, you know that whatever brigade was there has no more tanks of its own. So these have to come from somewhere else. And given that Ukraine hasn't tanks growing on trees, you know that on other fronts, especially you can start recognizing the viscons, so basically the tactical signs shown on those tanks, you know that on another front, there are less tanks. So you might attempt either infiltration, either a all-out mechanized attack. This thing, as I told you, is why operationally the Russians are having the upper hand. For once in this war, there is a very specific technical ability on the Russian side to see what they're doing, analyze what they're seeing, and making the right moves. And you can see it. If you want a example, the screen in Dobropilya is bringing the exact results I told you before everyone else got. It has nothing to do with we're going to cut the road to Dobropilya right away with 200, 300 guys and we're going to call it today. No, you push the Ukrainians as back as possible. You force them to defend 15, 20 kilometers behind your actual objective, which is, of course, Pokrovsk-Leningrad, and you finish up completely surrounding them while the Ukrainians are still trying to kick you out from Dorozhany. 3 months, guys. As I said, a proper analysis due to that technical aspect that you have, and once again, this is just to justify the losses per se. The rest, you can add UMPKs, you can add V2S, you can add a fuck ton of elements that the Russians have integrated in their capability to shape and dictate the pace of the combat. And of course, the capability to have more manpower. But once again, we're just speaking about how the fuck are we seeing more Ukrainian equipment destroyed than before. And of course, in order to say there are more equipments that are being destroyed, you need to have the evidence for that. And of course, as I said, optic fiber FPV, by the capability to say what are you destroying, where are you destroying, how are you doing it, is one of those elements. Now, as I said, operationally, thanks to this new potential, and one thing that you need to know, every FPV, every Prince Vandal of Novgorod that is sent there has a specific serial number, which means that the Russians can track who made the drone, who shipped where, which unit had it, and they can also calculate the efficiency, because we only see what worked in a certain sense. But the Russians themselves now have a complete full picture on who does what. And because of that technical advantage, you're going to derive a tactical advantage, an operational one. And yes, this war right now is purely, and this is a joke we made within the group, is middle management taking over, beam counters taking over, and saying, okay, how many fucking FPVs you need? What's the efficacy ratio? Let's say 60%, which means that in your area, you're going to have one roughly brigade of crops. This guy is going to have somewhere between 300 and 500 vehicles of all kinds. In order to erase them in 1 to 3 months, you would need that, I don't know, 5 per vehicle plus 60% of that 5, which means that in case of 500 vehicles you're targeting, you're going to need 2,500 plus 1,500, so 4,000 FPVs. That unit, except if it gets attacked while exploiting the area, with those 4,000 FPVs, and with a specific target logic, is going to waste the Ukrainians on the other side. And without the Ukrainians actually fighting, without a proper counterattack, imagine with a counterattack. This, of course, has its own risks, as the Ukrainians are facing, as you cannot just fight with FPVs and drones. You need the infantry, and also need to actually, at some point, understand that Ukrainians are going to see the attrition going up, their inventory is going down, so they're also going to start changing their playbook. And if you are not well equipped and well prepared on the front line and start getting to this monotony of raping the whole, you're going to end up like a couple of drone ops around Zapo. You're going to get bombed. And that thing is going to send your drone op teams to start to scramble, and the Ukrainians are going to follow up. This is what they tried to do twice in Kupiansk. So, at some point, despite the fact that it's still a positive thing, because trying to pull them out makes exactly the counter to what you want to actually have if you're Ukraine. You're going to get your vehicles wasted. Look at Rodinske if you want. In Rodinske, they are just sending equipment. You can see the streets are littered with their shit. But still, they advance, take back the city, and then they got pulled back again. They advance, take back the city, and pulled out again. Of course, this is a net negative for them, because they're sacrificing assets just to smoke out infantry. And they're getting baited to do that. And now we go to the tactical aspect. And the tactical aspect, as I said, in this case was that the Russians finally went to a specific unit or type of unit which target would be to cooperate with the forces on the ground. And I already explained Pisarivka, the moment that Russians needed someone to have a kind of low-cost, close air support. That's when Rubicon started doing his shit. And Rubicon was only noticed by June 2025. However, the predecessor of Rubicon, guys like Bobro, Sudoplatov, already had cost Ukrainians huge damage during the counter. Nobody spoke about that. We spoke about drones, but Rubicon, as such, is just a institutionalized force within the Russian military, who now is applying basically the same recipes that the VKS or the artillery. It's just that they are smarter. They had a blank check, obviously. And most importantly, they bet on the right horse. They have the right connections. For instance, you could see that the comparison between the OptiFiber bought in China on the Ukrainian to the Russian side was 1 to 5. So what happens with that OptiFiber? 5 times more drones. That's the most basic shit that you can make as a analysis. It's not exactly that, but even 3 times more drones means that you're going to have 3 more OptiFibers to go after your shit. And you have already less shit than the other guys. Rubicon goes beyond simply some kind of unmanned force that would do everything. Rubicon is part of the team. Whereas Magyar, for a long while, was doing his own shit. We spoke about this. And this thing is also true for other units that have nothing to do with drones. Azov, for instance, are skirmishers. They're doing their own PR. The moment they touch some hard wood, They mostly pull back. Azov didn't insist on Dobropila. If you see what's going on Dobropila and around Pokrovsk, it's literally the GSO and Gear that going after the Russians there. You don't see Azov doing this shit. Why? Didn't Azov liberate Dobropila and took out the salient? Not really. We're going to repeat this. The problem with Ukrainians, once you start seeing the losses, but also the way they are acting, is that because there is no real accountability from the foreigners that actually spend their money on Ukraine's survival, but also zero accountability within Ukraine. The instance of Yermak, for instance, is exactly that. That dude is cancer for Ukraine, and we would have liked him to stay as long as possible at the helm. But he still is mostly scot-free. Whereas the Russians, who allegedly thrive in corruption and have nothing, have literally committed a purge. 80% of Shoigu's cabinet is gone. And the funny part is that the Moscow Times was saying that there was this potential dog-eating dog situation when Putin, since 2024, has put like over 150 high-ranking people in jail or under investigation. I mean, for fuck's sake, Timur Ivanov literally has decided to go and join Storm Z or sign a contract in order to forfeit his sentencing. How does it even work with allegedly no actual accountability corruption-wise? And once again, as I said before, things are rosy in Russia. There's still a lot of stupid shit happening, still a lot of problems that the Russians are not sure yet how to solve. And this is in a certain sense why it worked so well for some things. So for instance, the fact that they completely blew up the Shahids, completely blew up the Optifiber, but there's still not a proper structure to defend against long-range drones. And in a certain sense, the most recent attacks on the Black Sea have a lot to do with maybe the fact that suddenly the Russian air defenses are becoming better. So now the Ukrainians, they're going to go after easier targets, because going against the Russians, despite some success they have, is still extremely costly for them. So what you're going to do? You're going to go after the weak and the defenseless tankers. Maybe, who knows, cargos, trawlers. Doesn't matter for them. For Ukraine, there is no such thing as naval warfare law or law warfare, generally speaking. They will cheat, they will lie, they will take advantage of innocent people. For instance, you got 8 guys who actually were given life sentences, despite the fact that Ukrainians used them. And I completely understand why the Russians did it, in a certain sense, is also to make an example. If you're stupid enough to let something like this happen, well, what the fuck are we doing? There is still a criminal liability, even if you didn't know. You're still responsible for that. So, once we start looking at it like that, and seeing what's happening with the tankers, with ships, especially third party ships, then we start understanding that the lack of accountability towards Ukraine is not just about the numbers, it's just not about the results, it's about everything. Ukraine might very well go and blow up a dirty bomb in Moscow tomorrow. And you will have, I bet $1,000 on it, zero condemnation. You will have something like Crocus, where it was basically, they got what was coming to them. And a lot of people tried to stop the Ukrainians for actually bragging about and mocking the Russians over it, because the terrorist threat is still a very powerful stigma, especially for Americans. But Ukrainians didn't fucking care. And now with only Turkey basically saying what's going on is absolute mind-blowingly shitty, and everybody else being like, we don't know, whatever. This attitude is exactly what you should expect from Westerners. So the accountability that you always don't have for facts, things that you see every day, is true for other stuff that should absolutely not be overlooked. And some of the statements that were made both by the military wing, we had the Italian NATO commander saying that we need to preemptively strike Russia, or at least hit Russia, although he was speaking about the whole array of means, so cyber, whatever, goes hand to hand with what's going on right now. I don't know if you guys read the latest Guardian piece, but there is a smell of war that a lot of countries are trying to do, because for instance, Germany or France, in a certain sense, war has become the stimulus. They do not see anything else, given that economically they are going down, and a lot of their economic prowess was linked to the fact that a huge market like Russia was having a win-win situation, even with Crimea being a shit show. Everything has a consequence. But nobody thought that to last 4 years, maybe the Europeans were stupid and thought that Russia was going to fall earlier than that. Maybe the Europeans thought that Russia was going to fall Ukraine faster than that. And the logic was to still, hold on the frozen assets and stuff like that. But what it shows right now is a complete lack of vision of how things are going to go. And in a certain sense, this is the funny and absolutely paradoxical thing. Trump has no fucking plan. The only thing he wants is to stop the war, because in a way or another, it's costing him a lot without actually fighting it. His idea, the American idea, was to stop China from becoming this huge hegemon. The problem is that they cannot solve the Russian situation because the people who are supposed to deal with Russia are indigent, both the Ukrainians and the Europeans. And it comes both by as I said, a lack of accountability, but okay, what the fuck are you doing now? How are you going to solve this as Ukrainian? And also with a lack of, actually, let's be honest, self-reflection. You want Ukrainians to do this and that, they cannot do it, so what remains to be done? You have to fight Russia. But unfortunately, you don't have the equipment, and as sure as fuck you don't have the public opinion to go to war against Russia. Especially not for Ukraine, when you now start learning that it's still a shithole. People are corrupt, shit is stolen, and you understand that you have 300,000 deserters or people away without leave, and you're like, if they don't want to fight this war, why would we? And of course, this message is amplified by pro-Russian outlets, but the reality is still there. If manpower was an issue, why don't you leave wherever you are in Europe and go and fight? There are a lot of cases like that happened 2022, 2023. But after that, the influx was back on the other side. So, what to expect? Nothing. As I said, for Europeans, the war stimulus is the shortest shortcut they found to try and have something. Even if there's no war, they would spend the money and still push the can down the road, and the next government in 10 years or 15 years will have to deal with the consequences. This is what Europe is right now. But at every level. It's both a captive continent and a fearful continent. It's captive to the American political and military supremacy. And it's a fearful continent to engage with things that are outside of its captive mode. So basically, why the fuck wouldn't you drop Ukraine? Why wouldn't you go and talk with Monkey and say, listen, bro, we understand this is extremely sensitive to you. We're not going to allow you to gobble the rest of it. Just fucking stop the war. We are pinky promising whatever the fuck you want to stop it. And then you can move back into Ukraine and restart the whole shebang and have Russia even more weakened. And then you move on for the kill. This is the worst scenario. But nobody in Europe is able to do this simply because we have a political class that's worse than Redditors. There is no Machiavellism at all. These people, when they followed Biden, they had no fucking clue how long it was going to last and how much it's going to cost. When after year 1.5, there was this huge bill of 2 trillion euros because of the losses that you had to pay the Russians, but also the fact that you had to change supplier, methods of transport. The investment on tankers that was supposed to be over 1,000 LNG tankers is not even halfway. And the prices have almost doubled for the construction of these vessels. And this is something that, once again, Timur Criminal told you right off the bat. The switch of supply lines and the severing of other suppliers, in this case, we have just decided, the European Commission and Parliament has decided that we will never buy Russian gas again. And I'm like, first of all, you have a huge problem with the World Trade Organization because the war is going to stop at some point. And you're going to need to actually justify why you have as your motherfucking directive, so your core law, that you're not going to buy from one guy. That's discriminatory. So basically, everybody's going to come at you and say, oh, you know what? I'm not going to buy your fucking shitty cheese. And we're not speaking about Russia. The precedent will mean that the Chinese, once the war is over, are going to fucking hammer us on every corner. Even for shit that they cannot produce as us. So once you start looking at it like that, you start seeing that we don't have accountability amidst our own. So the European political class, but also American, but that's another logic, is just fucking reckless based on assumptions and based on demagoguery. Then what the fuck do you want to win a war? The only way to win this war would be to have been prepared, unfortunately, like the failed painter, up to a point to go at it right off the bat. And then try to avoid that it becomes an actual world war, which would push the Chinese to support the Russians openly, and we're back to square one, which is getting raped. But this time by actual, a Mongol, Asian, orc horde coming back for another Berlin Love party. In this case, it's going to be probably Brussels because it's not Berlin anymore. And nobody seems to actually understand that this is what nobody wants. While the Ukrainian war might be absolutely absurd and horrible and criminal on so many aspects, it still remains a border war. Like a fuck ton of those in human history. But nobody wants to fucking escalate and nuke ourselves out. If someone wants that, I know that sometimes I've joked about Sarmat on WIF, and they need to get their heads checked. This is why we don't have already nukes on Kiev and everything was over. Because nobody actually wants to fucking die for some cocaine midget somewhere in fucking Kiev. And yes, unfortunately, that demagoguery on the European side, but also on American side, tries to tell us that there is no big boys policy, there is no big boys supremacy here. Which is nuts. Of course there is a big boy game. America can go and fucking strike fishermen or drug dealers or whatever boats off the coast of Venezuela and start threatening. Who's gonna say to America, oh, you're doing the same thing as Russia in 2022? Nobody. No fucking body. It's the same thing. The funny thing is that at least the Russians, they didn't start killing off Ukrainian fishermen off the Azov Sea. So when people start talking about hypocrisy and all this shit, it's very complicated when there is nobody to hold accountable other people. But it's always the same based on how the structure is right now, which is unfortunately still the West holds sway on major international institutions. But once those are avoided, like it's what is happening in Ukraine, you can see that both sides are playing dirty. And then what? Who's gonna stop the Russians now without direct intervention? Nobody. And everybody's like, yes, 4 years. Yeah, 4 years when you have probably over 200,000 Ukrainians have been killed. And probably over 600,000 irregulars in total. Although we had a Ukrainian deputy saying 500,000 wounded and 500,000 killed. True or not true, I don't really care because the losses are already huge, even with the baseline. So, what is there to be said anymore? You have an unhinged power being covered by its own supporters and sponsors. And this gives, as usual in these cases, the exact contrary of what it's supposed to be. Being shielded of its failures do not make you more prone to actually succeed. It actually makes you lose longer, harder, and in such a way that you will never come back. You will not. And that's it. And the most recent attempts to negotiate this peace process is exactly that. Trump starts to smell that the problem with Ukraine is not as much as they are good or bad or whatever. The problem with Ukraine is that they are not going to win this. And he said it blatantly multiple times. They're not going to get back that land. They're going to go back that land. And if the war keeps going, they're going to lose whatever they try not to give up. And the more we advance, we're going to have the principle I told you. There are going to be less balls in each pot, but on one pot you're going to have 3 balls, on the other 60. And you pick 1 ball each and every time, or 2. So another round of this, and then what? What does Ukraine has to offer? Except begging for an intervention. Once again, this is a matter of accountability that was never there. Militarily, politically, economically, Ukraine was never told to, dudes, you're gonna get fucking hammered. Stop with it. Instead, how Arakamia told on Kikil TV, we're not gonna talk, we're gonna fight. As Johnson put it out. But actually Johnson didn't act on his own. Like, everybody was there like, we're gonna do it. And it had nothing to do with Bucha. If for whatever was lost at Bucha, you signed off probably somewhere like 160,000, 180,000 people killed, then that's the definition of insanity. And you can see it. They're going to lose Uliapolye, they already lost Stepnogorsk, they lost Pokrovsk, they lost Mirnograd. Guys are now way too deep in Konstantinovka, so you'll have to restart the whole process. Kupiansk, there are voices about a counter, but once again, it's going to end up as usual with Ukrainians maybe gaining a couple of weeks or months more over Kupiansk. And in a certain sense, it's also logical, because if Pokrovsk is closed, and the Russians decide to take it slow beyond there, it's going to facilitate some kind of swap for Ukrainians to defend very specific positions. In this case, Kupiansk is a huge issue if it falls completely and is exploited by the Russians. Because they're going to take over the whole Zherebets Oskol line. And I told you guys, then the bottleneck coming from Izium towards Slovyansk and Kramatorsk is under FPV control. You're done. You lose Liman, and you lose the other side. So they're going to approach Konstantinovka from the north. And there was supposed to be one of the best defended lines of the Ukrainian side. All it took was nobody keeping tabs on Zelensky immediately after Kursk. And this I told you guys right off the bat. Kursk is where Ukraine definitely loses the war. It's only a matter how much does it lose. And it has a very perverse result and influence on Ukraine as well, because having no accountability over Kursk and having Syrskyi organize this shit show, fail it to the best of his abilities, and then have a trickle-down effect, losing Toretsk, having Russians Konstantinovka, having this whole 5-6 cities being under threat. Imagine losing Uliapolye and then warchief. Then you lose the possibility to actually do something about the Crimean land bridge in short term, even in medium term. So, the moment nobody stopped Kursk fast enough or told the Ukrainians to get the fuck out of there fast enough, somewhere between mid-October and end of November, it was over. And that's the beauty of this. And that's why when you start reading the ISV or Kaufman, all these guys, you do not see anyone turn around and say, oh, that was a big fuck up and it's now fucking up everything else. No, we had, remember, the Russians are underperforming tactically. I'm like, what the fuck can I say? Russians were underperforming tactically, but now we are learning that the Russians are losing less assets, therefore causing a lot more long-term damage to the Ukrainians. But they're also underperforming tactically. So, like, at some point, someone has to also keep tabs on what was said, because it's 4 years, and 4 years we got the Rusi saying something. Remember when they said, oh, attrition is going to win the game for Ukraine? I'm like, holy shit. Then we had Kaufman himself started to describe how Ukraine with a leaner structure was going to be better than the Russians. And now you got the Russians literally hunting drone ops. You got the Russians literally sending AI self-arming and targeting drones 50, 60 kilometers beyond the front. Latest video, I hope it was a VTU, but even if it was a Shahid 107, it's just the same thing. So we are into a logic of absolute misunderstanding and absolute lack of accountability at every level in this war. In a certain sense, for a lot of people, it's either a game or a fucking social experiment. And they're getting paid for it. They're getting to feel that high that Ukrainians felt in Kursk, but these guys are feeling that high by trying to predict shit. And I'm not gonna lie to you guys. I think every guy in the team had that high when we predicted to the line the counter in 2023. It happened the way we said would happen, even worse actually. And we felt jaded because there was, like, I already spoke about this multiple times. At no point Zelensky said, okay, we fucked up, we're not going to win this way, and nothing is changing the way we want, so better stop it, take a deal, because now it's going to be a lot less worse than in a year or two. And now we have Zelensky doing Kursk, same thing from the team. We also had a high because honestly, we didn't think the Ukrainians were going to be that stupid. They were. It fails. Zelensky doesn't take a deal. And everybody says the next one's going to be worse. 2025. Complete shit show. Russians screen to Dobropila, take Pokrovsk, are in 5 other cities. It looks like shit. Trump proposes a 28 fucking point plan, which is still bullshit. Zelensky refuses it. Zero accountability. What do you think? The next deal is going to be better? When they're going to fucking maybe start besieging Zaporozhye city? I mean, at this point, it's not that Zelensky is the worst enemy of Ukraine. He's just in this Zugzwang, in his fucking vicious circle. He cannot get out. Because everybody's trying to justify legalizing or illegalizing whatever is going to be signed with the Russians, if ever. But it makes no fucking sense, because at the end, that he signs that piece of paper or not, he's not going to change the Russians literally severing Zaporozhye in two and moving up the fucking Dnieper River. And at that point, it will not be about accountability anymore. That it will not matter if you hold Zelensky accountable, if you fucking hang him or Yermak, whatever. The problem is that who's going to hang them? Right now, it's still Ukrainians that can hang the asshole, the Sapunist. But tomorrow it might be the Russians. And then there is nothing to discuss anymore. And then you can come with this bullshit like Zalupichka said, oh, the strategic victory is that we kept our fucking independence. You didn't keep it, because to be independent is to be territorially sovereign. And right now, despite the fact that I'm pro-Russian, Ukraine is still missing 20% of its territory. Therefore, it's not a sovereign country. It's occupied and controlled by a neighbor. It's also not able to pay its fucking bills. It's a failed rump state, just a bit too big to be called rump state. There is nothing else to be discussed here. But of course, we will discuss bullshit. European leaders are gonna fucking talk about the letter of the law and all this nonsense. Where they're at the same time trying to steal Russian assets. Again, no accountability. You said to the Ukrainians to go and fight and get fucked, but no way you're gonna fucking put your money where your mouth is. No, it has still to be money that you're gonna fucking start stealing. And then what? Okay, you stole those 140 billions. You gave Ukraine another 150,000 killed. And now you don't have the money to actually ask the Russians to pay reparations if the Russians do not lose the war. And the only way the Russians are going to lose it is if you fucking intervene. But for as long as Trump is there, he's not going to do it. Because going after Russia as NATO and the US means that China is going to fucking back up Russia. Not because the Chinese are super, super mega friendly, which at this point they are, but simply because it means that Russians and some Chinese are gonna die in Europe, wasting that fucking place, while the Chinese are gonna go back after a Russian or fucking European victory and rebuild the shit. And nobody thinks that this is where we're going. The EU speaks about war, but has no fucking idea what it's gonna cost us. It's so beautiful. The absolute lack of foresight that I completely start to understand why some people are conspiracy theorists, because there is, except from America having mind rape in the European leadership, I don't see how this is fucking possible. How you can look at this, do this, and say, "Oh no, it's fine. Oh, let's take one for the team, continentally. 600 million dead." That's what it is. We got from leaders to managers to now part-timers. And this recycled part-timers, because you have people like Sanya Marin, who literally condemned the Ukrainians to get exterminated, who works now for Tony Blair to help Ukrainians buy more weapons to kill themselves. And that's what it is. There's nothing more to be said here. It is the stupid and the suicidal leading everybody else. That was it, guys. Sorry for the rant at the end, but I really wanted to impress on you the fucking problem about accountability and how much it plays a huge role on how bad things are for Ukraine strategically on the short and medium term. On the long term, there is hope for Ukraine if Monkey dies. Because I really think that despite all the issues that he has as a world leader, Monkey is the guy behind the situation with Ukraine. There is something there. there is this no step back mentality when it comes to Ukraine. He had no issue letting go of Armenia in a certain sense. Of course, there was a problem. I'm not going to say that he was happy about that. But for Ukraine, he's insisting on things that even I think he's not going to get at its fullest. Thank you very much, guys. I will most probably do a thread over the projection for 2026 in 2026 or at the end of 2025. This one's going to be a very long thread. It's not going to be a criticism of whoever. I'm going to probably use a couple of articles I'm reading right now, but it's going to be a projection to what we're seeing. And honestly, it's pretty clear cut what the Russians want to do. First of all, narrow and eliminate the maneuver space in depth and width in Zaporozhye. This would most probably contribute to the Russians being that close that they're going to start attacking the city on its south and east with FPVs. The second part is that once Zaporozhye is solved, then you're going to have, in my opinion, a lot more amenable positions on the Russian side for negotiations, but those negotiations are going to be extremely hard on the Ukrainian side. Why? Very simple. Because right now, the Russians do not want to negotiate due to the threat to the Crimean land bridge. And I told you that multiple times before, despite everything that has been done, the gap remaining is still too wide. It's right now about 70 kilometers gross maneuver space in width. And to the nearest cutting point, it's still about 90 kilometers. Which means that if the Ukrainians, for some reason, become a bit more competent, you could run into trouble out there. I'm not saying they're going to succeed into actually managing to cut the land bridge, but they might very well, by attacking there, pull you out of whatever objectives you're right now. For instance, taking the whole of Donbass and then penetrating deep enough, both in Kharkov and Dnipropetrovsk, so that the Ukrainians stop the war and then start asking for terms that would be favorable to you, of course. And therefore, the core strategic task remains the gap at Zaporozhye. The core political task, which for the moment obviously trumps everything else, is the Donbass. Because, as I said, once you have the Donbass within its limits, you have a toe in Dnipropetrovsk, because there's this huge salient, and you have another toe into Kharkov Oblast, which means that what you didn't manage to do in 2022, so have a access from south of Kharkov Oblast, over Barvinkoved and so forth, you're going to have it. And as sure as hell, this means a phase 3 of war at some point in very short term, because as sure as hell, the Russians would not like to have the Ukrainians fortify and prepare for something else. That was just some kind of spoiler of what's to come. Thank you very much for the attention. I'm sorry that it was a bit ranty at the end. And see you next time. Bye-bye.